When the people of Greece started coalescing into the first settlements, the Olympian gods sought to establish everlasting cults by providing patronage to these new communities. One group, located on a small hilltop in central Attica, caught the attention of two deities. Poseidon, the lord of the seas, and Athena, the goddess of wisdom, both hoped to win over this group. Poseidon arrived first to the Acropolis. He struck the ground with his trident, and salt water sprang from the rock itself. Seeing this, Athena planted the first ever olive tree on the Acropolis. Judging Athena's gift to be more valuable, Cecrops, the half-man, half-serpent king of the people, chose her as their patron deity. The city was thereafter named Athens in her honor. The kings continued their rule in Athens until the lineage reached King Aegeus. Aegeus was unable to have children and consulted the oracle at Delphi. Sadly, he did not understand the prophecy and he sought advice from Pythias, king of treason. Pythias understood it quite well. He got Aegeus drunk and gave him his daughter, Aethra. However, she left the sleeping Aegeus and wandered near the sea, where she met Poseidon. Soon, she gave birth to a strong boy, whom she named Theseus. The boy grew up in the land of his mother, but when he reached adulthood, he set out for Athens. On his perilous journey, Theseus defeated 6 notorious bandits, freeing the land from their terror. The tales of his deeds preceded him, and Theseus was welcomed to Athens with great celebrations. After capturing the Marathonian bull, and thus proving his royal lineage, he was reunited with his earthly father Aegeus and took his rightful place as heir apparent. Soon after his arrival, the Athenians celebrated the Panathenaic Games in honor of the goddess Athena. Androgeus, son of King Minos of Crete, traveled to Athens to participate in the games. Being a strong and skillful youth, Androgeus won several events, gaining adoration from the crowd. However, not all Athenians were pleased to see him win, and he was assassinated. When King Minos learned of his fate, he brought his mighty fleet to Athens, demanding the killers be handed over. King Aegeus did not know who had killed the young man, and he surrendered to Minos. In an act of revenge, Minos demanded that every 9 years, the Athenians send 7 young men and 7 maidens to his island for sacrifice. For, you see, Minos had a minotaur, half man, half bull, dwelling in the labyrinth beneath his palace. When the third ship was preparing to set sail, Theseus replaced one of the youths on board, hoping to rid Athens of this terror. He sailed off brandishing a black sail, but promised his father he would return with the white sail if he was successful. Upon arriving on Crete, Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, fell in love with Theseus. Heeding the advice from Daedalus, the architect of the labyrinth, Ariadne gave Theseus a ball of thread he could use to navigate the labyrinth. Using the directions from Daedalus, he found the Minotaur. A great fight ensued, and the beast was slain, finally freeing Athens from its yoke. Theseus, the Athenians, and Ariadne all snuck onto the ship and sailed away for Attica. Caught up in the celebration, Theseus forgot to change his black sail. Seeing his ship arrive, Aegeus, believing his son had died, was stricken with grief and flung himself into the sea. The sea was later known as the Aegean in his honor. Taking the throne of Athens, Theseus worked on uniting the whole of Attica under his rule. He abolished the governments of other lesser towns and created a single unified government located in Athens. Thus, the smaller regional units forming the peninsula merged into the Athenian Polis. Theseus lived a generation before the Trojan War, with his sons taking part in the legendary conflict. The kings of Athens continued ruling until brothers Medon and Acastus shared the throne, not as kings, but as the first Archons of Athens. Historians believe that the contest between Athena and Poseidon is one of the oldest traditions in the city. A saltwater spring, known as the Sea of Erechtheus, and an especially old and crooked olive tree growing on the Acropolis gave rise to this mythical tale. From the old archaeological evidence, predating even the Mycenaean civilization, historians have concluded that the city gave the name to the goddess Athena, who later became a prominent member of the Greek pantheon. In contrast, the tradition concerning Theseus is much more recent, likely originating from the fall of the Minoan civilization. Like all great founding fathers, Theseus is credited with introducing a plethora of customs and important ideas to Athens. He not only saved Athens from the Minoans, but also invented democracy, justice, and the idea of polis itself. He was a paragon of intelligence, wit, insight, and wisdom, but also a capable warrior and athlete. His life was embellished with many stories concerning his exploits from his eventful youth to his later years. Theseus would remain a celebrated hero throughout Athenian history. Hoping to preserve the memory of their founder king, the Athenians vowed to keep the ship of Theseus in a seaworthy condition by constantly replacing planks and ropes, thus giving rise to a famous philosophical debate. What better way to connect this mythical founder, who embodied all the virtues Athenians most prized, to the great philosophers of classical Athens? The myths of early Athenian kings originated from stories passed down from the time of the Mycenaean and Archaic periods, when the city was ruled by a series of hereditary kings known as basileia in ancient Greek. Initially, they faced challenges from neighboring settlements in Attica. Over time, however, they all pledged their allegiance to Athens, and the Athenian ruler became the paramount basileus of the entire region. This early unity laid the groundwork for the eventual synecism of the entire region into the Athenian polis. Although Athens was an important palace center in the Mycenaean world, it was largely overshadowed by its mightier neighbors, like Mycenae, Thebes, and Pylos. However, following the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC, Athens would emerge at the forefront of Greek history. Athens was possibly the only major palace center that survived the destruction seen throughout the Greek world. This remarkable fact survived through the stories of the Heraclidae and later the Ionian migration, where Attica served as a safe haven while the rest of the Greek world was crumbling. But even though the Acropolis survived, Attica as a whole suffered like the rest. Broader systems collapse, loss of key trading partners, climate change, widespread famines, and other issues affecting the Great Bronze Age civilizations also impacted Attica. These refugees, looking for a stable realm, would find a depopulated region with a failing centralized ruling structure, not much different from the areas they had fled. But the survival of Athens was not for nothing. The early Iron Age revival, around 1050 BC, heralded by the appearance of proto-geometric pottery, is first seen in Athens. By 900 BC, Athens controlled the entirety of Attica, and rich grave goods show a significant increase in wealth and thriving overseas trade. In the 8th century, the population of Athens rose sharply, yet the Athenians did not partake in the early colonization movement. Instead, the large plains of Attica offered more than enough space for the growing population. Soon, numerous new settlements were established across the peninsula, making Attica one of the most densely populated regions in Greece. Synecism of all towns and villages into a single political unit under Athenian leadership started around the late 9th century and was completed around the middle of the 8th century, finally giving rise to the Athenian polis. Synecism of such a large and densely populated region is still a poorly understood process. It was likely voluntary, and by the end of the 8th century, every citizen of Attica considered himself Athenian. There was never a recorded attempt by any of the towns in Attica to declare independence from the Athenian polis. All citizens of the peninsula were equal in the eyes of the law, and they could all participate in the government of the polis on the same footing. Although in practice only those living in and around Athens or those wealthy enough to travel could easily have their voices heard. During the late 8th century, the basileus of Athens was replaced by a trio of magistrates known as Archons, meaning the leaders. The leading official was the eponymous Archon, who held the most power and prestige. He had overall supervision of public affairs, including presiding over the council and the assembly. He also held the chief judicial authority in the city. The second Archon was the Polemarch, the chief commander of the Athenian armies. The title of Basileus survived through the third and final official, the Archon Basileus, who held chief religious authority in the city. He also presided over lawsuits regarding religious matters. Originally, the Archon served for life, but soon the term was limited to a period of 10 years. Then, early in the 7th century, the term was shortened again to only a single year. Additionally, 6 judicial officials, known as the lawmakers, were added, making up the governing body of the 9 Archons. These offices were held firmly by the aristocracy. The Archons were elected from a small circle of wealthy and powerful families known as the Eupatridi, meaning people with good ancestors. Once their term in office ended, the Archons were admitted to the Council of the Areopagus. The council formulated important policies for the state, and the Archons had to consult them on important matters. In this way, the former Archons, who served on the council for life, could exercise their political will. The role of the General Assembly in this early period is unknown. It was likely nowhere near as important as it would become in later years. but according to Aristotle, the assembly elected the Archons from among the Eupatridi candidates. The basic social unit of ancient Greece was not the individual, but the household, known as the oikos. The oikoi of Attica, as well as other Ionian polis, were divided among 4 tribes. Although treated as ancient, these tribes only emerged around the 8th century when the earliest polis began to take shape. During the early years of the Athenian city-state, these divisions served political and military purposes. Each tribe was likely responsible for fielding a contingent of the Athenian army. The tribes were divided into smaller units known as phratri, meaning brotherhood. These phratries were likely a remnant of warrior bands led by the early Iron Age chieftains seen in Homeric epics. Over time, the phratry evolved to serve another purpose focused on matters of family and descent. Membership in the phratry was necessary proof that a man was a citizen of Athens. The aristocratic oikoi formed powerful political clans. The genos, as it was known, was based on shared ancestry and provided strong ties among its members. These clans held virtually all the political power in Athens. It was amidst this struggle for control between the clans that the groundwork for Athenian democracy was laid. The first truly historical story from the Athenian annals is known as the Conspiracy of Cylon. A capable youth, Cylon of Athens, won glory in 640 BCE by winning a foot race at the Olympic Games. With a wreath of olive leaves from Olympia came everlasting glory and fame. Leveraging his newfound fame, Cylon married a daughter of Theagenes, the tyrant of small Megara. Hoping to install a favorable government in his larger neighbor, Theagenes helped Cylon seize control of Athens. Theagenes gained power in Megara by slaughtering cattle of the rich, who allowed their animals to graze on the farms of the poor. So too would Cylon, himself a member of the Eupatridi, need to secure the support of the poor farmers. According to Thucydides, Cylon traveled to Delphi and consulted the oracle. He was informed that he should seize the Acropolis during the grandest festival of Zeus. Taking this to mean the Olympic Games, Cylon and his followers, armed by Theagenes, invaded Athens in 632 and successfully captured the Acropolis. However, Cylon was not met with the welcome he might have expected. Instead of siding with him, the Athenians abandoned their farms and besieged the invaders in the Acropolis. It appears that Cylon misunderstood the prophecy. Apollo instead instructed him to seize the city during the festival of Diasia, when all of Athenian citizens left the city for celebrations, leaving the walls unguarded. Starving and dehydrated, Cylon saw the writing on the wall. He and his brothers snuck out of Athens, leaving his supporters in the hands of the angry mob. They took refuge in the Temple of Athena. The most sacred ground in the city, the temple offered a divine protection and no harm could come to those within. The eponymous Archon of the year was Megacles, and it fell to him to deal with the invaders. After some negotiations, they agreed to leave the temple if and only if Megacles and the Athenians allowed them to live. In one version of the story, the men tied a rope to the statue of Athena and descended from the Acropolis to stand trial. However, the rope snapped and the mob fell upon them. Other versions of the story make no mention of the rope, but the outcome was all the same. Not one man was left alive. Although Cylon was the orchestrator of the plot, he was not the most prominent figure in the story. Athens was saved from a despot, but a far greater threat still loomed over her. By killing the invaders, Megacles broke his oath and defiled the city with sacrilege. He would have to be put on trial, but in ancient Greece, not a man but his entire clan had to answer for his crimes. Megacles was a member of the Alcmenoidi, the most prominent family in all of Athens. Two of the greatest Athenian statesmen, Cleisthenes and Pericles, were also members of this family. It was a great shock then that Megacles was found guilty, and along with his entire family banished from the city. Even the dead members were exhumed and their bones removed from Attica. The city was finally cleansed of this great sacrilege. The Alcmenoids would, however, have to find their way back to the city. During their exile, Megacles' son Alcmaeon served as an intermediary between the exceptionally wealthy Croesus, king of Lydia, and the oracle at Delphi. For his service, Alcmaeon was awarded as much gold as he could carry. The Alcmenoids, now considerably wealthier, would soon return to Athens, where they would play a major role. At that time, Athens had no codified set of laws. This meant that the aristocracy, which held firm control over the Archons and the judiciary, could bend the oral tradition to their will. Furthermore, the state had no way of dealing with murders and other serious crimes. This meant that the families themselves sought vengeance, often leading to blood feuds that could last for decades and destabilize the entire polis. Therefore, in the wake of the conspiracy of Cylon, around 620, city officials commissioned Draco, an otherwise obscure figure. He was tasked with drafting a comprehensive set of laws that would be equally applied to all citizens regardless of their social class. Most of these laws have been lost to history, with only the sections concerning both intentional and unintentional homicides surviving to this day. These were the only parts of the law retained after later reforms of Solon. Draco's laws were notoriously harsh, with death being the punishment for even minor crimes, such as stealing an apple. Athenian orator Demades, living in the 4th century, quipped that Draco's laws were written in blood and not ink. According to Plutarch, when Draco himself was asked why he chose death as punishment for most offenses, he replied, "The lesser ones deserve it, and for the greater ones no heavier punishment could be found." The memory of these harsh laws survived through linguistics, reaching even the English language, with the term draconian referring to excessively harsh punishments. Although these laws would not stay in use for a long time, they did have an important role to play in the development of Athenian democracy. First, the magistrates could no longer bend laws to suit their needs. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the state became the main arbiter between the families, starting a long process of increasing the authority of the state. Although Draco's laws went a long way in establishing the equality between the people in the eyes of the law, they did little to solve the real issues in the city. The political and economic inequality remained the main source of tensions in Athens, and a lot more was needed to prevent a descent into chaos or tyranny. Athens of the early 6th century was a land of many opportunities, however few were exploited to their fullest potential. Poor land quality in Attica made it unsuitable for the production of wheat. However, the climate was perfect for growing olives, grapes, and figs. High-quality Athenian olive oil was one of their most valued export goods, along with the fine pottery found across the Mediterranean. The mines of Laurium in the south provided silver, and Mount Pentelicus in the north was a source of the praised Greek white marble. These resources, however, were mostly controlled by a few elite families. Already costly wheat became prohibitively expensive for the poorest citizens. Many had to resort to debt bondage, leading to quickly escalating tensions between the classes. In this time of strife stepped in Solon, a man with a reputation for wisdom and high moral character. Solon was an aristocrat, although recently his family had fallen on hard times. When he reached adulthood, he took up trade, a profession usually shunned by the aristocracy. Slowly but surely, Solon made his way across the Greek world, amassing a small fortune. During his travels, he observed many other Greek city-states and studied their governments. He also grew increasingly sympathetic to the poor. In his absence, the political situation in Athens deteriorated and the city was on the brink of a civil war. Returning to his city, he worked on reconciling all the unhappy factions, and he was elected eponymous Archon in 594. Upon taking office, he started work on a set of reforms that would not only quell the instability, but also unlock all the potential Athens had within its reach. Solon first tackled the problem of debt bondage. Many Athenians had fallen so deeply into debt that they had to sell their family members or even themselves into slavery. Solon outright banned the practice of securing loans by someone's freedom. All men and women who had fallen into slavery were immediately freed. He tracked down those sold out of Attica and returned them to their homeland, restoring their citizenship. Second on his agenda were the almost equally poor hektemoroi, or six-parters. These men worked the fields of wealthy landowners to whom they owned 1/6 of all produce. The sources do not specify what happened to the hektemoroi, but under Solon's reforms, Athens became primarily a land of free small farmers, suggesting they could retain the land they occupied. These momentous events were known as the seisachtheia, the shaking of burdens, and for generations they were celebrated in a festival of the same name. Having relieved the suffering of the poorest men in society, Solon started work on strengthening Athenian export markets. He reformed the weights and measures of Attica, adopting the widely used Eubaic standard. This helped facilitate trade with nearby Polis. Solon banned the export of much-needed grain and instead encouraged the production of high-quality olive oil. Solon granted full citizenship to all craftsmen who had settled in Attica, prompting many skilled potters and metal workers to move to Athens. He also made it mandatory for fathers to teach their sons a trade. Lack of any valuable economic skill became a punishable offense. It is no wonder that in the late 6th century, the Athenians developed a new style of pottery known as the red figure, and Athenian exports became widely praised across the Mediterranean world. Setting a strong foundation for a thriving economy, it was then time to deal with the old oligarchs. The aristocracy in Athens would no longer be based solely on noble blood, but on material wealth. The population was divided into 4 social classes based on their income. The richest were the pentakosiomedimni, those whose income exceeded 500 bushels of grain or its equivalent. Only these men were eligible for the archonship. Although many noble families fell into this class, the highest offices of the state were now open to wealthy commoners. Below them were the hippeis, or horsemen. They had to produce between 300 and 500 bushels of grain. These men were wealthy enough to own a horse and could serve as cavalrymen in the army. Next were the zeugitai, with an income between 200 and 300 bushels. These men were wealthy enough to own a team of oxen. They were the hoplite class of ancient Athens, able to afford the full armor and weapons. They were eligible for lower offices of the state. The final and poorest class, the thetes, had an income of less than 200 bushels. Thetes served as light troops or sailors in the Athenian navy. Although they could attend the general assembly, they seldom had the free time to travel to Athens and participate in the government. Slaves, non-citizens known as metics, and women had no political rights in the city. Solon could not entirely abolish the Council of Areopagus, but he diminished its role by establishing a new council of 400. It consisted of 100 men from each Athenian tribe, selected from the top 3 classes. The Council of the Areopagus retained some of its judicial authority, while the Council of the 400 prepared business for the assembly and thus shaped the laws in Athens. Solon also implemented sweeping reforms in the judicial system. He established a body of jurors, chosen among all classes, to hear appeals of the decision of the Archons or hold trials for misbehaving magistrates. Traditionally, only the family of the victim could bring forth charges, but Solon opened this process so any skilled orator could advance the case of an aggrieved party. Most of the old draconic punishments were reduced, and amnesty was granted to all exiled men not charged with homicide or tyranny. It is likely that under this policy, the Alcmeonids returned to Athens. Apart from these broad reforms, Solon introduced a set of wide-ranging laws concerning all matters of public and private life. These laws were inscribed on wooden tablets and displayed in the agora for all to see. His works stand out for their remarkable scope and creativity. His laws in many ways define the concept of citizenship in Athens. By abolishing debt bondage and the hectemoroi, Solon both created a citizen body that would make a strong basis for democracy and drew a clear distinction between free Athenian citizens and their slaves. For these reasons, he is often regarded as one of the fathers of democracy. Around the middle of the 5th century, when the young Roman Republic was embroiled in the conflict of the orders, a delegation was sent to Athens to study Solon's laws. This led to the creation of the 12 Tables, the first codified set of laws in ancient Rome. The 12 Tables served as the basis for all later Roman laws, making Solon's laws the backbone of all Western legal tradition. Pleased with their new constitution, the Athenians swore an oath not to alter any laws without Solon's approval for the next 10 years. Fearing that the aristocrats might pressure him into bending the laws, Solon went into voluntary exile, traveling the Mediterranean world. During his travels, he visited Egyptian priests who told him the tale of the destruction of Atlantis, likely a reference to a massive eruption on Thera in 1600 BC. He then traveled to Lydia, to the court of the wealthy Croesus. According to a probably fictional story, Croesus showed off his wealth to Solon and asked him to judge who the happiest man in the world was. Solon proceeded to name Greek men who had already died, asserting that a man's happiness could not be measured until he had met his end, for fortune was a fickle mistress. It just so happened that Croesus was later defeated by the Persian king Cyrus the Great and sentenced to be burned alive. Before the pyre was lit, Croesus is said to have called out for Solon 3 times. Inquiring about this name, Cyrus learned of the great Greek lawgiver and his cautionary tale. Recognizing the wisdom in his words and fearing divine retribution, Cyrus spared the Lydian king and made him an advisor. Even Plutarch questions the veracity of this tale based on the chronology of the events, although the timeline could fit. Later in life, Solon would lament that while trying to make everyone happy, he managed to please no one. Ironically, however, after his death, Solon was regarded as the champion of both democratic and anti-democratic factions within Athens. Try as he might, Solon was unable to eliminate all discontent from the city. Although his reforms did much to alleviate the suffering of the poorest citizens, they intensified the competition for political offices, thus playing a role in increasing civil strife. In this situation, three political factions emerged in Athens. The men of the coast, centered around southern Attica, were mostly craftsmen. They largely supported Solon's reforms. The men of the coast were led by an Alcmenoid, another Megacles. The rich landowners, based in the fertile interior, formed the men of the plains. The last and largest party were the men of the hills. These were the poorer citizens living in the northern highlands. The men of the hills wanted even more radical reforms in favor of the poor. They were led by a young and charismatic man known as Pisistratus. Pisistratus was a distant relative of Solon and, according to some sources, his lover. He won glory by capturing the port of Nicaea from nearby Megara. Pisistratus and the men of the hills likely had support from the numerous city dwellers. Around 560, Pisistratus launched his first coup attempt. He appeared before the assembly, brandishing a conspicuous wound, claiming there had been an attempt on his life. The assembly was stacked with his supporters, and although Solon objected, they voted to give him armed bodyguards. Carrying weapons in the city was strictly forbidden, and Pisistratus used his bodyguards to capture the Acropolis and the reins of government. He ruled the city for 5 years, but the men of the plains and the men of the coast put aside their differences and deposed Pisistratus. The two factions soon quarreled, and Megacles lost support from both sides. Embittered, he allied with Pisistratus and worked to place him back on the Athenian throne. According to Herodotus, they came up with the far and away the most simple-minded plot he has ever heard of. He was puzzled how anyone, let alone Athenians, could fall for this ruse. The two men found a tall and beautiful woman. They clad her in full battle gear and showed her how to pose. The woman climbed on top of a cart, and Pisistratus drove around Attica, claiming Athena herself had chosen him. Heralds were sent all around, shouting this wonderful news, and the Athenians welcomed Pisistratus back to the city. He married Megacles' daughter to secure the alliance with the Alcmenoids, but he had 2 sons and refused to have more children with her. When Megacles learned of this, he was furious, and Pisistratus was once again removed from the city. His third and final attempt came in 546. He would not rely on an elaborate ruse this time, but on military might. After his exile, Pisistratus and his sons retreated to Thrace, where they established a bustling colony. They exploited the rich silver and gold mines on Mount Pangaeus. Amassing a large fortune, Pisistratus hired a large mercenary force. He was finally ready to make his return. He moved to Eretria on Euboea, just in view of Attica. He secured aid from Thebes, Argos, and the friendly tyrant of Naxos. He also hired capable Eretrian cavalry. With this great force, he landed in Marathon and marched towards Athens. In his absence, the poor were likely oppressed by the aristocracy, and when they learned of Pisistratus' return, they flocked to his side. The opposition in Athens gathered a small force and marched to meet the would-be tyrant. Pisistratus would need the support of all Athenians to rule effectively, and he sought to limit bloodshed. He caught the Athenians off guard, and the army was easily routed. His sons, leading the cavalry, soon caught up with the fleeing troops, but they did not attack them. The men were assured there would be no reprisals, and they were free to return home. Pisistratus was welcomed back to the city, and he would rule it until the end of his days. Although Solon ultimately failed to prevent the slide into tyranny, his reforms played an important part in shaping its course. Pisistratus followed most of his laws and even expanded the rights of the poor. Although his tenure is sometimes described as the law-abiding tyranny, he employed a troop of Scythian archers to guard him at all times, and the high offices of the state were stacked with his supporters. The extremely wealthy Alcmenoids and other powerful clans abandoned the peninsula, fearing for their lives. Pisistratus seized their lands and distributed them to the landless masses, gaining further support from the poor. Pisistratus further expanded Solon's economic policies. He encouraged the planting of even more olive trees, greatly increasing olive oil exports. Under his rule, Athens overtook Corinth as the largest exporter in Greece. Red figure vases began appearing from the Black Sea to the eastern shores of Spain. He or his sons introduced the first Athenian coins, the tetradrachm, affectionately known as owls. They were silver coins stamped with an owl on one side and the image of Athena on the other. Over time, the tetradrachm became the standard currency of antiquity, widely used until the crisis of the 3rd century. Pisistratus imposed a flat 10% tax on all farmers, increasing the state's revenue. One surviving story describes his chance encounter with a poor farmer working on the slopes of Mount Himetz after this tax was implemented. The tyrant inquired of the man what he was producing, and he replied, "Nothing but stones, and I suppose Pisistratus will be wanting his percentage." Impressed with his honesty, Pisistratus relieved the man of his tax. This story shows that the Athenian small folk had a positive memory of their tyrant. With large amounts of wealth coming into the city from trade, Pisistratus began several large construction projects. He rebuilt the temple to Athena on the Acropolis and began the construction of the temple of Olympian Zeus, the largest temple in mainland Greece, which will be completed only centuries later. He also built the first Athenian aqueduct, providing a source of clean water. This allowed many artisans to move into the city, further expanding their economic activities. Pisistratus also funded religion and the arts, enhancing the city's reputation. He likely founded the Panathenaea, an annual festival celebrating the goddess Athena. Every 4th year, the festival was celebrated on a larger scale, known as the Great Panathenaea. It was accompanied by athletic and poetic competitions modeled on the Olympic Games. Pisistratus decreed that Homer alone could be performed during the festival. For this reason, he commissioned definitive versions of his 2 epics. The festival of Dionysia was moved from North Attica to Athens, becoming the 2nd most important festival on the peninsula. During Dionysia, the Athenians performed plays, giving rise to Greek drama. Pisistratus also expanded Athenian influence in the Aegean by establishing a strong network of alliances. He installed his ally Lygdamis as tyrant at Naxos, who in turn installed Polycrates in Samos. Sigeion, founded by Athens, slipped from its grasp, but Pisistratus recaptured it and sent one of his illegitimate sons to govern the city. Additionally, Miltiades, leader of the rival Philaid clan, was sent to Thrace to establish a foothold on Chersonesus. Pisistratus guided Athens through an unprecedented period of growth. A city of small farmers was transformed into an economic powerhouse of the Mediterranean. Arts and culture flourished under his watchful eye. The stage was now set for the Athenian golden age of the classical period. The governing bodies created by Solon stayed in place. Although sidelined for the time being, they would soon take over power and establish a lasting democracy. Pisistratus died in 527, leaving Athens to his 2 sons, Hippias and Hipparchus. They were men of different character, but they shared power equally. The elder Hippias was a shrewd politician, well positioned to follow in his father's footsteps. The younger Hipparchus, however, was not interested in governing the city and spent his days indulging in earthly pleasures. He gathered some of the most famous Greek poets in Athens, including Simonides of Chaos, Anacreon of Theos, and Lassus of Hermione, famous for his histless hymns. 2 Athenians, Aristogaton, an older man in his 20s, and Harmodius, a handsome youth in his teens, were in a pederastic relationship. However, Harmodius caught the eye of Hipparchus, who made his advance. He was rejected by the youth, but he was not the one to take no for an answer. During the Panathenaea, Hipparchus forbade Harmodius' sister from participating in the procession. This was a grave insult to his family, as only virgins were allowed to take part. Scorned, Harmodius and his lover Aristogaton decided to finally end the tyranny by cutting down the 2 tyrants. They chose the Panathenaea of 514 to carry out their plot. During the festival, the 2 men noticed one of their conspirators engage in a conversation with Hippias. They feared the plot had been betrayed and rushed through the city. As by fate, they stumbled upon Hipparchus and fell upon him. The tyrant was slain, but so too was the young Harmodius. Aristogaton managed to slip away, but he was caught. According to Thucydides, he died no easy death. Hippias, now alone on the throne of Athens, angry about his brother's death and afraid for his own life, finally turned tyrannical. All known associates of the 2 lovers and other potential enemies of his regime were tortured to death. Hippias was slowly losing the support of the people, and it was plain for all to see. The exiled Alcmenoids, with the wise Cleisthenes at their helm, saw their chance to return to the city. During their exile, when a temple of Apollo in Delphi burned down, they underwrote a contract and bore the brunt of the expenses for the rebuilding. They also supplied the temple with the highly praised Parian white marble, where the contract required them to provide plain stone. This left the oracle in their debt. After this, whenever Spartans went to Delphi for advice or any matter, each response started with, "First of all, free Athens." Sparta enjoyed a reputation as the enemy of tyrannies, and in 511, the Spartan king Cleomenes decided to act. The first Spartan expedition was pushed back by Hippias and the Thessalian horsemen. However, the Spartans sent Cleomenes with a large army in 510. They defeated the Thessalians and blockaded Hippias on the Acropolis. He sent his children away for safety, but they were captured by the Spartans. Hoping to save his children, he agreed to the negotiations. He was promised amnesty, and he voluntarily abandoned the Acropolis and sailed away, settling in Anatolia. The price for their freedom was steep, and the Athenians were compelled to join the Peloponnesian League. The whole Pisistratid clan was expelled from Athens in perpetuity, and a column describing their crimes was erected in the city. Unhappy with the role the Spartans played in expelling the tyrants, the Athenians chose to glorify the two lovers, Aristogaton and Harmodius. A life-size statue of them was created and placed on the agora. However, during the Persian invasion in 480, the original was stolen and taken to Susa. Although it was later returned by Alexander, it was never copied and it is now lost. The Athenians commissioned the replacement in 477. This version, known as the Tyrant Slayers of Athens, became famous and was copied numerous times. The original replacement is now lost, but several Roman copies survive to this day. Owing to his role in the expulsion of the tyrants, Cleisthenes believed he would have popular support in the city. However, an ambitious rival, Isagoras, with support from the Spartans, was elected Archon in 508. He gained support from the aristocrats by promising to revoke the citizenship of those who had gained it through Solon's reforms. Cleisthenes gathered the affected craftsmen and a large number of poor citizens who feared the rise of another oligarchy. Isagoras, outnumbered, sought help from the Spartan king. Cleomenes arrived with a small force and expelled the Alcmeonids and several hundred loyal households named by Isagoras. The two men then abolished the assembly, but this move backfired immediately. The population revolted and blockaded them on the Acropolis. When Cleomenes tried to enter the temple of Athena, he was barred by the priestess, who told him to turn back. Defeated and humiliated, Cleomenes and Isagoras abandoned the city, and Cleisthenes and other exiles were allowed to return. Fearing Spartan reprisal, the Athenians abandoned the Peloponnesian League and agreed to become subjects of the Persian Empire. When the Spartan threat failed to materialize, the Athenians ignored their promise, but the Persian kings did not forget it. To prevent any future power grabs, radical reforms were needed in the city. Cleisthenes took this task upon himself. He first divided Attica into 3 geographical regions: the city, the shore, and the inland. These regions were somewhat based on old divisions between the men of the hill, coast, and plains. Each region was then subdivided into 10 smaller areas, comprising different numbers of existing towns and villages. Cleisthenes then took one area from each region and combined them into a tribe. In this way, he created 10 tribes of Athens. The old council of 400 was replaced with a new council of 500 known as the Vuli. 50 men were chosen from each of the 10 tribes by lot. The members were chosen by lot to prevent one man or family from gaining too much power. The Vuli prepared business for the assembly and managed financial and foreign affairs. 500 men were too large in number to do anything effectively, so the year was split into 10 equal parts, and each tribe was in charge for one part. The 50 presiding members were called Prytanes, and the Athenians started using Prytani as a measure of time. The Athenian army was reorganized on a tribal basis. Each tribe was responsible for electing a taxiarchos, the commander of the infantry, a hipparchos, the commander of the cavalry, and most importantly a strategos, the general-in-chief. Strategoi were not chosen by lot and could serve as many consecutive terms as they liked. In time, the Council of 10 Strategoi became the most important governing body in the city. Unlike Solon, Cleisthenes was not given a special mandate to reform the politics of the city. Therefore, his reforms had to be passed through the assembly. In this way, the people voted to give themselves executive power over the city, and the world's first democracy was born. The Greek word demokratos is a combination of two terms, demos meaning the people and kratos meaning power. While most of the powerful families lost the bulk of their influence, some retained control of important religious cults. One family that was least affected by these reforms and therefore retained most of its power base was the Alcmeonids. Cleomenes, still angry about the whole ordeal, gathered a large force against Athens. The Peloponnesian League allied with Boeotia and Chalcis and Euboea. The allied forces marched to Attica in 506, starting the Boeotian War. However, once the Corinthians learned that Cleomenes planned to install Isagoras as a tyrant, they objected and returned home. The rest of the Peloponnesian allies soon followed, and the invasion crumbled. Following this disaster, the Spartans were forced to organize the League Congress. As the Greek civilization was preparing to enter a new period of prosperity, a large threat was looming in the east. Join us next time as we discuss the rise of the mighty Achaemenid Empire. The Alcmeonids, Alcmeonids, Alcmenoidi, Alcmeon, Alcmeonids, the Alcmeonids, Hectemoroi, Hectemoroi, Pentacosiomedimni, until he had met his end, until he had met Ideu